Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the next episode of the show. And today I'm going to be talking about a topic which is very difficult, which is very complex, but nevertheless is very, very important, and I think is something that the more we all talk and discuss and look at this issue, the better. And that is the issue of domestic abuse or domestic violence. A very, very difficult topic, but one that is real, that's been real for centuries, happens all over the world, is not specific to one area of the world or one country, is not specific to one type of people, and unfortunately happens everywhere. Certainly for us here, the statistic that is normally given is that 1 in 4, and sometimes people say 1 in 3 people will suffer some sort of domestic abuse or violence at some point in their life. Most of the people that suffer are women, but not all. There are men that suffer as well. Most of the time we will say that if we look at the patterns of behaviour, the power and the control that is linked to domestic abuse, we can see these patterns everywhere. So if you were to follow people who were suffering in Britain and ask them the sort of pattern of behaviour, it would be the same here in Egypt, in Pakistan, in Norway, in Europe, anywhere, in America. So that the pattern and the style of control and power is basically the same everywhere. And as I said, there's no one type of person. You know, I think there's sometimes an image that the kind of person that would perpetrate this kind of behaviour would be from a certain background or certain status or certain social status, and of course it's not the case. All backgrounds, people from all different economic levels of society, people who are professionals, people who are not working, people who are maybe at the bottom of the ladder in the society, and people who are at the top, and everything in between. So I think the first thing for us to remember is that this is something that people are suffering all over the world, and mostly women, but men as well. And I think once the other pattern of behaviour that is very similar is that once somebody is suffering or in this situation, it is actually very difficult for them to get out of it. And often, again, that's part of the pattern where the person who's being abused is perhaps made to feel that it's their fault, or they're made to feel guilty, or they're made to feel that they brought it on themselves. Anyone who's going through this kind of abuse, whether it be physical abuse or emotional abuse, will always have a very low self-esteem. So they will always make themselves feel and be always made to feel that they are worthless. They're made to feel that they are to blame somehow, and then they make themselves feel that actually maybe there's something that they could have done about their situation. So I think people who are going through this kind of abuse are always made to feel that they're worthless, and make themselves feel that as well, and their self-esteem will always be very, very low. And of course it's not just physical abuse, it can be emotional, psychological abuse, violence, used in various ways, including sexual violence and other forms of violence as well. And of course, as Muslims, we are in all of these categories as well. So whether it be in Britain or in Egypt or in Europe or in America, the statistics are there, and in all of these countries, Muslims are both perpetrators and they are victims as well. And of course, for us, the added difficulty that we have is that often we see I think a misunderstanding of the faith, I think a misapplication of some of the teachings of the faith, and in some way people actually feel that they can somehow justify this kind of behaviour through the faith. And I think that's where it becomes an added difficulty for us and an added issue. Now there's one main verse in the Quran which many people over hundreds of years and are still now debating and discussing, which is in Surah 4 verse 34. So Surah 4 verse 34. And it's really the main one verse, and it's a very small verse, and it's the main verse that's used when people talk about this issue. And even when you look at online and you refer to, if you were to Google this verse, you would see the level of debate and discussion and how much emphasis is placed on this. So much so that I even checked again recently with somebody who is very, very knowledgeable in all of this kind of work, and asked her, you know, are we really talking about this one verse that causes so much debate and discussion and actually difficulty when it comes to the Muslim understanding of this issue and of domestic abuse, and how that's had an impact on our communities, and how it's really really troubling for many, many people? And she of course said, yes, there are other references, but this is the main verse that causes so much anxiety. And it is very difficult, you know, this verse there where it talks about sort of control and men and how they can control women by hitting, and the various different translations that are used for this one verse. So it's very difficult. It is there. It's there in black and white, and whatever translation we use clearly is always going to be there. And over years, and even now, and even modern kind of times, as well as in the past, these issues have been problematic and difficult for Muslims to somehow to deal with. And I think we need to remind ourselves that the pre-Islamic society that the people were in at the time was very, very harsh. Women were treated like objects, women were owned by men, and women were bought and sold in a way that we actually find difficult now to imagine. Men were, not all, but men generally, the society allowed for men to be very violent and very, very kind of, it was a very harsh environment they were living in. And when Islam came, women actually, clearly the people came from that background and became Muslim, but they brought with them their cultural baggage, and they brought with them all sorts of different ways of doing things. And women complained to men, and the Prophet complained to the Prophet, that the men were often harsh and violent, and the Prophet himself felt that he wanted to even prohibit any physical violence towards women. And there was one incident where women complained to him. He then said that actually he would say that it wasn't allowed, and the men then came to him in the evening and said, you know, what are you doing? You're giving the women advice in such a way that it's actually making it very difficult for us, because the women will have an upper hand. So there's always this toing and froing, even directly at the time of the Prophet, about this issue, about violence, about how men, especially men, want to control and have, if you like, an upper hand over women by using violence, ongoing, sustained violence. And the Prophet, even from my understanding, and I'm obviously not a scholar, I'm just sharing reflections and things that people have taught to me and discussions that I've had over years and now, and will still continue to have on this issue. And the Prophet really asked or desired for a revelation to come about this issue, because it was causing him so much anxiety and so much trouble. And when the revelation came, and certainly this verse, that almost seemed a contradiction of what the Prophet had said and what the Quran itself was teaching. And Muhammad himself said, peace be upon him, that Muhammad wanted it, but God didn't. Meaning that there was, if you like, that God would not want a flat, total ban, or to discuss this in this way where it was very absolute, that hitting or violence towards women was not allowed. Now, of course, over the years, many scholars have looked at this and discussed it, and still are, and it's a continual issue. And I think we can't change what's in the Quran. We can't change what's there, and neither would we want to. And of course, this is a source of our life, and this is how we live our life, and we understand from it, we take from it, we learn from the life of the Prophet, and together these teachings are what give us our faith and our strength to move forward. So we can't change that, and neither would we want to. But we also have to look at and remember the life of the Prophet and how he was with people, and how we're told that he never hit any of his wives. And if we're really saying that we are living a life that is following the life of the Prophet and emulating him, then surely we have to do this in all aspects. We can't really be picking and choosing in a way that suits us one day and not suits us another, or we're following him in one aspect and not in another. And I think for me this is a fundamental part of this discussion and debate that really does need to be highlighted. You know, he never hit any of his wives, and this is what we've been told. And one thing that always strikes me is that even though we weren't there at the time of his life and how he was with people, peace be upon him, but we do have so much information, and we're so lucky to have this kind of detailed understanding of how he lived his life. And the other thing that has always struck me is how we don't hear the stories of the negative things that his wives could have said about him. You know, and if he indeed lived a life in private that wasn't the life that we know about from public, we'd know about that. We would know about it through stories, through even hints, through reports, and we just don't hear it. And I think that's something that we need to remember. And, you know, why is it that this one verse causes us so much anxiety and problems and try to discuss when there are so many other verses that outweigh this, that we can use his example, but also other verses from the Quran that talk about marriage, that talk about how people are, you know, the protectors, the friends of one another, and all of the amazingly beautiful, detailed verses that we have about marriage, but also about the Prophet's life, peace be upon him, how he was with his wives, the stories, the amazing, really probably the best love story ever told about Khadija, may Allah be pleased with her, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, and how they were as a couple, and their amazing marriage, and the journey they took with each other as he became a prophet, and how she was his best friend, and how she was the first one that became a Muslim, and all of the struggles and the difficulties that he went through, and how she was always there for him. You know, it's one of the best love stories ever told, I think. And how can we relate that to what we see when we see these violent, abusive marriages that are taking place all over the world and supposedly being justified in the name of this beautiful faith that we have? And even if we take this one verse, and many people have talked about, you know, lightly hitting or using a soft stick, and all of the debates around the language and the way it's used, how can that ever justify sustained physical, emotional abuse that is perpetrated on women and men all over the world on sometimes a daily, sustained basis, sometimes over years? You know, there is absolutely no justification for this type of behaviour anywhere in our teachings that can justify this kind of sustained abuse on any one individual. Now, thankfully, the jurists have asserted the principle of prohibition of harm among spouses. So there is this always, you know, when you actually come to discuss with scholars about issues around marriage and how a marriage should be conducted, and how that relates back to the teachings from the Quran and how the Prophet himself conducted himself, you know, clearly there's so many rules and so many rights that women and men have within their married life. And Muslim women especially, it's mentioned throughout, can ask for divorce purely on the basis of the fact that they're being abused as well. So divorce can be granted for this issue as well, and that's also something else that we need to think about. And the Prophet said, of course, the best among you are the best towards their wives. That's a massive statement, and a massive reminder and justification for all of us how important that relationship is, that the best people are those who are the best up to their wives. And of course we have to look again back at the time when he said this, and what kind of environment was he coming from, and what kind of people was he around, and the kind of way that women were being treated. And for him to then come in a beautiful, succinct way and say to people that the best people amongst us are those that are best to their wives, I think is absolutely profound, and something that we need to constantly be reminding ourselves of. And as I say, look at the wives, look at his wives. None of them ever spoke about any violence towards them, any kind of unhappiness in that sense. And of course, their marriages were not perfect. With any of these people, they would say there was ups and downs, as we all do. But in the end, when it comes to violence and abuse, there is no justification whatsoever for sustained, long-term abuse from one person towards another. And we're reminded in the again in the Quran, Surah 4, verse 19, "O you who believe, you are forbidden to inherit women against their will." So again, this is coming at a time that applies to all time, but specifically, especially for the time that he was living in, where very much it was part of women were just bought and sold and properties of men. And sometimes when I read the stories and the examples, I find it very difficult to believe and imagine that there was a society that was like that. And of course we read in other books, the Bible, and in the Jewish Bible as well, and many things that we read in there that are quite uncomfortable reading and really need sort of analysis and for help us to understand what they actually mean, because for us living now it's really hard. But I think one of the things we can say is that the principles and the teachings are there for all time. It wasn't just specifically meant for then. So when the Quran says, "O you who believe, you are forbidden to inherit women against their will, nor should you treat them harshly." Nor should you treat them harshly. Why is this written in the Quran? It's written specifically talking to people and saying, do not treat women harshly. It talks then about dowry and how important that is, and then it goes on to say, "On the contrary, live with them on footing of kindness and equity." So live with them in kindness and with equity. And there's another Surah 30, verse 21. "Among his signs he created mates from amongst yourselves, that you might find tranquility and peace in them. He has put love and kindness amongst you, in that are signs for those reflect." And certainly here in Britain, when you get a wedding invitation, you're almost guaranteed to have this verse on that invitation, and rightly so. It's such a beautifully written, it's a beautifully revealed verse that all of us can love and learn from. And of course it's totally contrary to some of what we have already been talking about. This is kind of relationships where people are made to feel that they're living in abusive, violent homes, where abuse is perpetrated on a sustained basis. And this discussion, this understanding is something that will be ongoing. And my advice to anybody who is suffering at the hands of somebody, whether they be male or female, whether it be their spouse or whether it be somebody else from their wider family, is that you really do need to get help, to talk to people, to not live with it without talking about it. We are all encouraged to, when we're going through difficulties, to talk to somebody. And whatever your circumstances, you need to find that person and talk to them, share it with them, explain to them what's happening, and find out how you can get help, because you do not have to suffer in silence on your own. I think one thing I wanted to just say and to share was some of the proactive work that Muslims especially are doing in this country, in Britain, on this issue. As I mentioned, sort of the 1 in 4, 1 in 3 statistic is quite shocking, and it doesn't mean that 1 in 3 people are suffering from abuse and violence for their whole life. Of course, it doesn't mean that. It just means that somebody has had some sort of incident. But it's the statistics that's shocking, but it's real as well. It's based on evidence and research, and we need to remember that's a statistic amongst our Muslim communities as well. And in this country, just to say generally, actually, the laws, the sort of the way that domestic abuse is addressed and dealt with and given the seriousness is much better now than even 10, 15, 20 years ago, when the attitude towards it was seen in a very different way to how it is now. And that's through a lot of lobbying and a lot of work in communities, not Muslim communities, just generally in this country, people working together with the police, with women's groups, with aid groups, to really try and help and understand what the issues are and how the response from the police, from the services, needs to be a lot better than it used to be. And thankfully that has drastically improved, and as a result of that, more people are reporting and more people are feeling that they can come out and talk about these issues and that they're taken seriously. And we have specialists, so within each police force in this country there are specialists who are there specifically to deal with issues of domestic abuse, issues which are still very, very difficult for people to come forward and talk about and need a lot of support. And we have specialists that are trained in how to specifically help those people. And that has meant that the reporting rates are higher, but still not, I would say, high enough. And also what it means is that the more people talk about this issue, the more likely people are to realise that if they do it, they'll be found out. And that is the other reason why it's so crucial that we talk about these issues. And thankfully, there are more Muslims speaking out. There are more imams, there are more community activists who are doing work on this issue. We recently had a conference, which is this one, Imams Against Domestic Abuse. This was in a conference that was held in basically one of the biggest main mosques in London, and it was imams and sort of scholars and speakers who all came together and actually to speak about this issue. And I thought that was a brilliant, positive. It's not the only one, but it's certainly a very, very positive step in the right direction on an issue that is very difficult for all of us to even talk about. But we have to. Keeping quiet is not an option. Keeping quiet if you're being abused is not an option. You have to find ways to speak. Community leaders and imams and activists keeping quiet about this is not an option, and we need to be encouraging even more. So we have khutbahs, we have people writing articles and journals, people discussing some of the difficulties with understanding this verse and other verses and teachings around it, and how do we make it so that we are all talking about this issue. And all of that, I think, is positive. And I would say that, men and women both need to be working on this issue. Certainly in the Muslim community, this is not a specific issue for women or men. It's something that all of us need to be working together on. We are saying that we are living the life and emulating our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. And if we really are serious about that, then this is one issue that we can't keep quiet about. And the more we speak, the more we work with our mainstream, partners of people from all backgrounds, the more good I think that we can do. And this is an obligation and a duty on all of us. And certainly if we feel that it will do good and stop this kind of behaviour from happening, then it can only really be a good thing. And just to remind ourselves of that beautiful verse once again, Surah 30. Among his signs, he created mates from amongst yourselves, that you might find tranquility and peace in them. He has put love and kindness amongst you. In that are signs for those who reflect. Such a beautiful reminder for all of us that this kind of abusive, violent relationships really have no place in our faith. They have no place in our society. And if people are suffering, and I would once again say to anybody who sees this, if you are suffering in any way, or if you know somebody that is, please don't feel that you have to keep it to yourself. Please feel that you need to speak, to open up, to tell others what's happening, and to get help. And for those of us who are working in our communities, we need to realise that, again, speaking out is not an option, and this kind of work needs to be happening more and more. We need to take inspiration from people like this and others who are saying, look, it's not an option for us to keep quiet. We all know that this is happening. We know that it's serious and very real, and we need to make sure that we do as much as we possibly can. So just in summary, really, to remind ourselves that while there's certainly a verse in the Quran that talks about this issue, and it's important for all of us to understand what that means. We can't change that, nor would we want to, but it is important that we understand it in context. It is important that we understand where it came from. It is important that we understand what the Prophet and how he dealt with this issue, and what he used to say to people, and the advice that he used to give, and his character and his way of being with his wives, and the lessons that he gave to men and women that were around him. These are important lessons for all of us. If we are really saying that we are following our faith and believing in the Quran and living the life that he lived, then this is something that can't be ignored. We can't pick and choose. And when we know that these things are happening, and we do know, you know, and I just feel so grateful that I have never been a victim of this, but clearly I know people that are, and that have been, and that are still are going through very, very difficult situations. Let's not shy away from it. Let's talk about it. Let's open up the discussion. Let's be the good people, whether we be Muslim or not, that talk about these issues, and to say that enough is enough, and that we're not going to be silent. We're not going to take these issues and not do anything about it. So let's come together, Muslims, men, women, with our friends and neighbours from around us, and really try and do something about this very, very serious issue. And on that serious note, I will say Assalamu alaikum, and see you in the next episode, inshallah.